The thermometer mounted to the log beam read 58 degrees inside Silas Thornton's dwelling, while outside the Montana blizzard drove temperatures to 23 degrees below zero. His fire had burned down to embers 3 hours ago, yet he sat comfortable in his shirt sleeves, watching through a small vent hole as his neighbor's cabin, a quarter-mile away, belched continuous smoke from a roaring fire that barely kept the man alive. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this fascinate you, subscribe because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The winter of 1839 hit the Montana Territory with a cruelty that killed men and animals without discrimination. Silas Thornton had survived 8 winters in the Rocky Mountains, trapping beaver along the tributaries that fed the Yellowstone River, but this season carried a malice he had never experienced. The cold arrived in mid-November and refused to release its grip. Temperatures dropped to levels that made breathing painful and exposed skin dangerous within minutes. Silas shared a rough territory with perhaps a dozen other trappers scattered across 100 square miles of wilderness. Most were men like himself, competent and careful, who had learned to respect the mountains and the dangers they presented. They built their cabins using methods passed down from older trappers or remembered from childhood homes in the East. The construction was standard and practical. Cut logs from nearby timber, notch the corners so they stacked properly, fill the gaps with moss and mud, build a door from split planks, and cover everything with a roof of poles and bark. A man working alone could complete such a cabin in 5 or 6 days. 2 men working together could finish in 3. These cabins kept out wind and rain adequately. They provided shelter from summer sun and autumn storms. But in the deep cold of a Montana winter, they revealed fundamental weaknesses that most trappers accepted as unavoidable facts of frontier life. The gaps between logs, no matter how carefully chinked, allowed cold air to seep inside. The single-layer log walls provided minimal insulation against temperatures that dropped far below zero. The roofs, constructed from materials chosen for availability rather than thermal properties, did little to prevent heat from escaping upward. Most significantly, the doors and windows necessary for access and light created openings that compromised whatever warmth a fire might generate. Silas spent that November watching his neighbors struggle with a problem that consumed their days and endangered their lives. Keeping a cabin warm required constant fire. Not a small fire for cooking or modest comfort, but a roaring blaze that devoured wood at an astonishing rate. A trapper needed to burn a full cord of firewood every 4 to 5 days just to maintain temperatures barely above freezing inside his cabin. This created a brutal cycle of labor. Each day required hours spent cutting, hauling, and splitting wood. The work was exhausting in summer. In winter, it became dangerous. Men working in extreme cold moved slowly, their hands clumsy in heavy gloves, their judgment impaired by the constant threat of frostbite. Silas noticed something else during those bitter weeks. Even with massive fires burning continuously, the cabins never achieved real warmth. A man might stand close to the flames and feel heat on his face while his back remained cold. The temperature near the fire might reach tolerable levels, but 10 feet away, frost formed on interior walls. At night, when men tried to sleep, they piled on every blanket and fur they owned and still woke shivering. Obadiah Holbrook trapped the Creek valleys 12 miles south of Silas's cabin. He was a methodical man from Vermont, 41 years old, with 9 winters of mountain experience. Silas had partnered with him during the spring of 1838, working adjacent territories and sharing supplies when convenient. They were not close friends, but they maintained the kind of practical relationship common among men who understood that survival sometimes depended on cooperation. On the morning of December 3, 1839, Silas made the journey to Obadiah's cabin to discuss trapline territories for the coming season. The cold that day was profound. the kind that made every breath burn in the lungs. He found Obadiah's cabin silent, no smoke rising from the chimney. The door was barred from inside, which meant Obadiah had secured it before sleeping. Silas called out. No response came. He forced the door open by removing the wooden hinges with his knife, a process that took 20 minutes in the brutal cold. Inside, he found Obadiah dead in his sleeping robes, his body frozen solid. The cabin's interior temperature was perhaps 5 degrees warmer than outside, meaning it had hovered near 20 below zero. The fireplace contained the remains of a fire that had burned out hours earlier, probably sometime after midnight. Reconstruction of what happened was straightforward. Obadiah had maintained his fire through the evening, then banked it carefully before sleep, using a technique that usually kept coals alive until morning. But the extreme cold had drawn heat from the cabin faster than the banked fire could sustain. The coals had died completely. Without the fire's warmth, the cabin's temperature had plummeted. Obadiah had likely never woken, the cold gradually stealing consciousness before death. Silas spent that day preparing Obadiah's body, and the next day, burying him in a spot where the ground was not completely frozen, a hillside that faced south and received full sun. He marked the grave with stones and returned to his own cabin, carrying Obadiah's small collection of personal items to send to family in Vermont if the opportunity arose. The death affected Silas deeply, not because of exceptional friendship, but because of what it revealed about the arbitrary nature of survival. Obadiah had done everything correctly. He had built a solid cabin. He had gathered ample firewood. He had banked his fire using proven methods. But a fire that burned out 3 hours too early had killed him as surely as a grizzly attack or a fall from a cliff. Silas realized that night, lying in his own cabin, listening to wind howl outside, that the standard approach to frontier shelter contained a fatal flaw. Men were trying to heat air inside wooden boxes that leaked warmth constantly. They were fighting a battle against cold that required continuous effort and allowed no margin for error. A single mistake, a fire improperly banked, wood that burned faster than expected, could mean death. There had to be a better method. Spring arrived late in 1840, the snow persisting into early May. When the creeks finally cleared and beaver became active again, Silas returned to his trap lines with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. But Obadiah's death had planted a question in his mind that surfaced during quiet moments. How could a man build shelter that did not require constant fire to prevent freezing? The answer appeared unexpectedly on a warm afternoon in late May. Silas was checking traps along a creek that ran through a series of rocky hillsides. He noticed tracks near a dense thicket, the distinctive prints of a large grizzly. Following protocol, he moved cautiously, rifle ready, tracking the bear's path up a slope to a dark opening beneath an overhanging rock formation. The opening was a cave, or more accurately a den, excavated by bears over many seasons. The entrance was perhaps 4 feet high and 5 feet wide, leading back into darkness. The bear was not present, having likely moved on after winter hibernation, but evidence of recent occupation was clear. Flattened grass and fur marked where the animal had slept. Silas approached carefully and crouched at the entrance. The interior of the den extended back approximately 15 feet into the hillside. The ceiling was earth and rock, supported by the natural geology of the slope. The floor was dry, despite recent snowmelt. But what struck Silas immediately was the temperature. Outside, the afternoon air was perhaps 55 degrees, pleasant after the long winter. Inside the den, the temperature felt warmer, perhaps 60 or 65 degrees. He entered cautiously, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The den's interior was not merely sheltered from wind. It possessed a warmth that seemed to radiate from the earth itself. Silas placed his hand against the earthen wall. It felt warm to the touch, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the outside air. He spent an hour examining the den, noting its features with growing fascination. The entrance faced south, receiving maximum sun exposure. The earth covering the den was at least 6 feet thick based on the hillside's profile. Water drained away from the entrance naturally due to the slope. The interior space, while crude, had maintained temperatures that allowed a massive animal to survive months of winter without any heat source beyond its own body. Silas understood immediately what he was observing. The earth itself was providing insulation and thermal stability. The ground beneath the surface maintained a relatively constant temperature, regardless of air temperature above. A bear hibernating in this den was surrounded by earth that stayed warm enough to prevent freezing, even when surface temperatures dropped far below zero. The principle was simple but profound. Instead of trying to heat air inside a wooden structure that leaked warmth, what if a man built his shelter into the earth itself? What if he used the ground's natural temperature stability as the foundation of his heating system, rather than fighting against winter cold with nothing but fire and hope? Silas completed his spring trapping season with adequate success, gathering enough pelts to justify the journey to St. Louis for trading. He left the mountains in late June, traveling by horseback along established routes that took 3 weeks to traverse. Most trappers made this journey with anticipation of whiskey, women, and gambling, spending their earnings in spectacular binges that left them broke and headed back to the wilderness within days. Silas had different priorities that summer. He sold his furs to a reputable trading house, receiving fair payment that he deposited with a merchant banker rather than carrying as cash. Then he began what other trappers would have considered insane behavior. He spent his days studying buildings. St. Louis in 1840 was a growing city, expanding rapidly as the gateway to Western territories. Construction was constant. Silas watched workers building everything from simple wooden structures to elaborate brick warehouses. He paid particular attention to foundations and basements, asking questions of workers who were initially suspicious of this rough mountain man's interest in their craft. He learned that basements stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. He discovered that root cellars dug 8 feet deep maintained temperatures around 55 degrees year-round, perfect for food storage. He watched masons building stone foundations, noting how they excavated below the frost line to prevent heaving and cracking. He examined drainage systems designed to keep water away from underground spaces. A German stonemason named Wilhelm took interest in Silas's questions and explained principles that Silas had observed but not understood. The earth below the frost line, typically 3 to 4 feet deep in Missouri and deeper in Montana, maintained constant temperature. This ground temperature was roughly equal to the annual average air temperature of the region. In Montana, that would be approximately 45 to 50 degrees. The Earth itself was a massive heat reservoir, largely unaffected by seasonal temperature swings. Wilhelm explained insulation in terms Silas could grasp. A foot of earth provided insulation roughly equivalent to a wooden wall several inches thick. 3 feet of earth was better than any wall a man could practically build from wood. 6 feet of earth was nearly impenetrable to temperature changes. If a man could surround his living space with earth, he would need very little fire to maintain comfort. Silas asked about structural concerns. How did one prevent an earth-covered roof from collapsing? Wilhelm sketched designs showing load-bearing posts and beams, explaining how weight could be distributed across multiple supports. He described how miners shored up underground tunnels and how the principles were similar for any structure supporting earth overhead. For 2 weeks, Silas absorbed information, filling a small notebook with sketches and notes. He purchased specialized tools, a broad axe for shaping beams, a plumb line for ensuring vertical posts, iron spikes for reinforcing joints. He bought canvas for waterproofing and clay for sealing. His purchases confused merchants who expected trappers to buy powder, lead, and trade goods. Silas returned to the Montana Territory in late July with a pack horse carrying supplies that made no sense to anyone who saw them. Heavy timbers for support beams, sacks of clay, rolls of canvas, specialized carpentry tools, and detailed sketches that looked like engineering drawings. Word spread quickly among the scattered trapping community. Silas Thornton had lost his mind in St. Louis. He ignored the speculation and began searching for the right location. The site needed to meet specific requirements that he had developed during his research and observation. It needed a south-facing slope to maximize sun exposure and natural warmth. The hillside needed to be stable, not loose soil that might collapse, but dense clay and rock that would hold its shape when excavated. Drainage was critical. The slope had to shed water naturally, preventing any accumulation that might seep into an underground structure. He spent 3 weeks exploring hillsides within his trapping territory, digging test holes, examining soil composition, observing water flow patterns during summer rains. Other trappers checking their own trap lines would occasionally see him, this solitary figure digging holes in random hillsides, taking notes, moving on to dig more holes elsewhere. He finally selected a site overlooking a creek valley approximately 8 miles from where Obadiah had died. The hillside rose at a gentle angle, facing almost due south. The soil was primarily clay mixed with rock, dense and stable. A small stream ran past the base of the hill, providing water access, but the elevation ensured his chosen building site sat well above any potential flooding. Trees grew on the slope, providing readily available timber for construction. Silas marked out the dimensions of his structure using stakes and cord. The living space would be 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, extending back into the hillside. This provided 192 square feet of interior space, slightly larger than his previous cabin. The entrance would face south, a single wall of logs with a door and small window. The other 3 walls and the entire roof would be earth. He began excavation in mid-August, working alone with a shovel and pickaxe. The labor was extraordinary. He removed earth 1 bucket at a time, carrying it away from the excavation site to prevent drainage problems. The hillside's natural slope meant he was digging into stable ground rather than creating a pit, which reduced collapse risk but required precision to maintain proper angles. Each day he dug deeper into the hillside, creating a cavity that resembled a large cave. He worked methodically, stopping frequently to check measurements and ensure the floor remained level and the ceiling maintained consistent height. The clay soil was both blessing and curse, stable enough to hold its shape, but dense enough to make digging exhausting. The excavation consumed 6 weeks of brutal labor. Silas worked from dawn until the light failed each day, removing earth that he calculated weighed several tons in total. His hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His shoulders and back ached constantly. But the work progressed steadily, the cavity extending deeper into the hillside with each passing day. By early September, the basic excavation was complete. He had created a space 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 7 feet high at the entrance, sloping to 6 feet at the back. The dimensions were deliberate. The 7-foot entrance height allowed him to stand comfortably near the door where he would spend most of his time working. The slight downward slope toward the back encouraged any moisture to drain toward the rear wall, where he had dug a small channel that would carry water away through a drain hole. The floor required careful attention. Silas removed loose soil and debris, then packed the clay surface until it was hard and level. He created a slight crown in the center, higher than the edges by perhaps 2 inches, to encourage water to run toward the walls rather than pooling in the middle. Along the perimeter, he dug a shallow trench, 6 inches deep and 4 inches wide, that would catch any water seeping down the walls and direct it to drainage points. The ceiling presented the greatest structural challenge. The earth above the excavation was approximately 6 feet thick at the entrance, increasing to 8 feet at the back where the hillside rose. This earth weighed thousands of pounds. Without proper support, it would eventually collapse. Silas needed to install load-bearing structures that would transfer this weight safely to the ground. He had purchased 4 massive timbers in St. Louis, each 12 inches, square and 8 feet long, hewn from oak and nearly too heavy for one man to move. These would serve as primary support posts. He positioned them in a rectangular pattern, 2 near the entrance and 2 toward the back, each set 4 feet from the side walls and 8 feet from its partner. He dug post holes 3 feet deep, set the posts vertically using his plumb line to ensure perfect alignment, then packed clay and rock around their bases until they were absolutely solid. Across the tops of these posts, he laid support beams, also hewn from oak, 12 inches square. These beams spanned the 12-foot width of the structure, resting in notches he had cut into the post tops. The beams would distribute the roof's weight across all 4 posts. He secured them using iron spikes driven through angled holes, creating connections that could not separate. Between the main beams, he laid smaller cross beams at 18-inch intervals, creating a grid pattern across the ceiling. These were logs approximately 6 inches in diameter, positioned to support the earth above while allowing adequate headroom below. Each cross beam was notched where it met the main beams and spiked in place. The resulting structure resembled the support system in a mine shaft, a framework of timber strong enough to hold the earth indefinitely. Word of Silas's project had spread through the trapping community by late September. The territory's scattered inhabitants occasionally crossed paths at shared water sources or while checking trap lines, and Silas's unusual construction became a topic of conversation and speculation. Most trappers thought he was building some kind of storage facility. A few suspected he was hiding from something or someone. None understood his actual intention. Amos Harland arrived at the site on a cool October morning. Amos was a loud man from Pennsylvania, 43 years old with 12 winters in the mountains and strong opinions about how things should be done. He had built 4 different cabins during his time in the territory, all following standard construction methods. He considered himself an authority on frontier building. Silas was working on the entrance wall when Amos rode up, dismounted, and stood examining the excavation with obvious confusion. The hole in the hillside, the timber supports visible inside, the piles of excavated earth, none of it made sense according to conventional understanding. "What in hell are you building, Thornton?" Amos asked finally. "A cabin," Silas replied, continuing to work on fitting logs for the entrance wall. Amos laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "That's no cabin. That's a grave. You're digging yourself a hole to die in." Silas did not respond, focusing on his work. Amos walked closer, peering into the excavation, shaking his head. "You've lost your mind," Amos continued. "Man's supposed to build a cabin on top of the ground, not burrow into it like some animal. What are you, a prairie dog? A badger?" "I'm a man who watched Obadiah Holbrook freeze to death in a proper cabin," Silas said quietly. Amos's expression changed slightly, the mockery fading to something more serious. Everyone knew about Obadiah's death. But the moment of reflection passed quickly. Obadiah died because his fire went out. That's bad luck, not bad building. You think hiding underground is going to save you? You'll flood out with the first heavy rain, or the whole thing will collapse and bury you. Either way, you're wasting your time and looking like a fool doing it. Silas set down his tools and faced Amos directly. "The earth 6 feet down stays warm all winter, warmer than any cabin can stay without burning cords of wood every week. I'm not hiding underground. I'm using the ground itself for heat." Amos stared at him for a long moment, then laughed again. "You're telling me dirt is going to keep you warm? That's the craziest thing I've heard. Fire keeps men warm, Thornton. Fire and good walls and a tight roof, not dirt." Within a week, Cyrus Pemberton visited, drawn by Amos's descriptions of Silas's madness. Cyrus was younger, only 31, but equally certain that Silas was making a catastrophic mistake. The 2 men stood at the excavation site, discussing Silas's project as if he were not present. Silas ignored the mockery and focused on solving the technical problems that remained. The support structure was complete, capable of bearing the earth's weight indefinitely. Now he needed to address waterproofing, insulation, and the entrance wall construction. Each presented challenges that required careful thought and precise execution. The waterproofing problem was significant. Earth was porous. Water from rain and snowmelt would seep downward through the hillside. Without proper barriers, moisture would eventually penetrate the ceiling and walls, creating unbearable dampness inside the structure. Silas needed to create a waterproof membrane that would shed water away from the living space while remaining durable enough to last for years. He started with his canvas, heavy material intended for wagon covers, waterproof when new, but requiring additional treatment for underground use. He unrolled the canvas across the timber ceiling structure, allowing it to drape down the side walls. The material covered the entire interior surface, creating a continuous barrier between the timber framework and the earth that would be packed above it. Over the canvas, Silas applied a thick layer of clay mixed with water to create a paste. He had experimented with different clay mixtures during the previous weeks, testing various consistencies to find one that would spread smoothly but dry hard. He added rendered animal fat to the mixture, approximately 1 part fat to 10 parts clay, which made the dried clay more flexible and water-resistant. He worked this mixture into the canvas, forcing it into the fabric's weave, building up a layer approximately 2 inches thick. The clay layer served multiple purposes. It added waterproofing, created thermal mass that would help stabilize temperature, and provided a smooth surface for the final earth layer. He allowed the clay to dry partially, then applied a second layer, building up total thickness to approximately 4 inches. The weight was substantial, but the timber framework supported it without difficulty. While the clay dried, Silas turned his attention to calculating heat retention. He had learned in St. Louis that earth provided insulation proportional to its thickness. He estimated that 6 feet of earth above his ceiling would provide insulation roughly equivalent to a wooden wall 3 feet thick. No conventional cabin could achieve such insulation. The earth walls, also approximately 6 feet thick at the entrance and increasing toward the back, would provide similar protection. He considered the total heat loss from his structure compared to a conventional cabin. A standard log cabin had 4 walls, a roof, a door, and usually a window, all of which allowed heat to escape. His earth-sheltered design had only 1 exposed wall, the entrance. The other 3 walls and the entire roof were earth-insulated. He estimated his heat loss would be perhaps 1/5 that of a conventional cabin of similar size. Ground temperature was the critical factor. Based on his observations and the information from Wilhelm, the earth surrounding his structure would maintain a temperature around 45 to 50 degrees year-round. This meant his structure would never drop below that temperature, even without fire. The entrance wall required the same careful attention to detail that Silas had applied to every aspect of the construction. This wall would be the only above-ground element of the structure, the single surface exposed to weather and temperature extremes. It needed to be strong, well-insulated, and properly integrated with the earth-sheltered portions. Silas had selected logs for the entrance wall with obsessive care, choosing trees of uniform diameter, approximately 14 inches, with minimal taper and straight grain. He had felled 8 trees, stripped them completely of bark using a draw knife, and allowed them to season for several weeks. The result was logs that were consistent in size and shape, without the irregular surfaces that created gaps in standard construction. He laid the first log directly on the clay floor at the excavation's entrance, bedding it in a thick layer of clay to create a seal against the ground. This sill log would bear the weight of the entire wall and needed to be perfectly level. He checked it repeatedly with his level, adjusting the clay bed until the log sat with absolute precision. The subsequent logs, stacked directly on top of each other, fitted together with a technique Silas had adapted from the stone construction he had observed in St. Louis. Instead of notching the logs at the corners, which created gaps and weak points, he extended each log past the corner by 2 feet on each end. Where the log wall met the earthen side walls of the excavation, He chiseled flat surfaces into the clay, creating pockets that the log ends would fit into. He laid each log carefully, checking for level and fit. Between logs, he applied a thick layer of his clay mixture, packing it tightly to eliminate any gaps. The clay would dry hard, creating an almost airtight seal. At the corners, where logs extended into the earthen walls, he packed additional clay, bonding the wood to the earth and creating a continuous seal. The wall rose slowly, each log added only after the previous one was perfectly positioned and sealed. By the time he reached the seventh log, the wall stood approximately 7 feet high, matching the ceiling height of the interior structure. The top log was notched to receive the ends of the ceiling crossbeams, tying the entrance wall structurally to the interior support system. For additional strength, Silas drove iron spikes through the logs at strategic points, pinning them together vertically. The spikes were 12 inches long, driven through one log and deep into the log below, creating connections that prevented any lateral movement. He positioned these spikes every 3 feet along the wall's length, creating a pattern of internal reinforcement invisible from outside. The result was a wall that was structurally integral with both the ground below and the earth-sheltered structure behind it. Unlike a conventional cabin wall that stood independent of its surroundings, Silas's entrance wall was anchored into the earth itself. With the entrance wall complete, Silas turned his attention to the roof's final layers and the critical waterproofing that would determine whether his structure remained dry or became uninhabitable. The clay-covered canvas provided a foundation, but it needed additional protection to withstand years of rain, snowmelt, and the freeze-thaw cycles that characterized Montana winters. He began by laying birch bark across the entire clay surface. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible enough to conform to irregular surfaces, and durable enough to last for years without rotting. He had harvested the bark during summer, selecting large sheets from mature trees and storing them flat under weights to prevent curling. Now he laid them in overlapping courses, each sheet covering the seams of the sheets below, creating a shingled pattern that would shed water downward and outward. Over the birch bark, Silas spread another layer of his clay mixture, this time thinned slightly with water to make it flow into every crevice and gap. He worked this layer with his hands, pressing it firmly against the bark, ensuring complete coverage. The clay would dry to a hard, water-resistant surface while the birch bark beneath provided a secondary barrier if the clay ever cracked. The final layer was earth itself. Silas carried soil from his excavation piles and spread it carefully across the entire roof surface. He started with fine soil, building up a layer approximately 6 inches thick, which he compacted by walking across it repeatedly. Over this base layer, he added coarser soil mixed with rock, building up the total thickness to approximately 12 inches at the entrance, increasing to 18 inches at the back, where the hillside's natural slope rose. The soil layer served multiple purposes beyond waterproofing. It provided additional insulation, increasing the total thermal mass of the roof. It created a growing medium for grass and small plants, which would root and help stabilize the soil while adding another layer of water management as vegetation absorbed rainfall. It restored the hillside's natural appearance, making the structure nearly invisible from a distance. Drainage required careful engineering. Water flowing down the hillside would naturally run over his roof. Silas created a subtle crown in the roof's surface, higher at the center than at the edges, encouraging water to flow sideways rather than pooling. At the roof's perimeter, he dug shallow channels that would catch this runoff and direct it around the sides of the structure away from the entrance. The side walls, where earth met the interior space, also needed waterproofing. Silas applied his clay mixture directly to the exposed earth, working it into the soil surface to create a hard, sealed layer. He paid particular attention to the junction where the earthen walls met the timber ceiling supports, creating careful seals that would prevent water from seeping through these natural weak points. Ventilation presented a unique challenge. The structure needed fresh air for breathing and smoke removal, but any opening created a potential water entry point. Silas designed a ventilation shaft that extended from the rear of the interior space upward through the hillside, emerging approximately 20 feet behind the entrance. The shaft was constructed from hollowed logs fitted together, angled slightly upward to prevent rain from running down. By late October of 1839, the structure was complete enough for habitation. Silas moved his supplies and equipment inside, arranging them on shelves he had built along the earthen walls. He constructed a sleeping platform against the back wall, raised 2 feet off the floor to provide storage beneath, and keep him off the cold ground. In one corner near the entrance, he built a small fireplace using flat stones gathered from the creek, with a chimney that angled up and out through the entrance wall. The first night inside felt strange. The silence was profound. Above-ground cabins transmitted every sound from outside: wind in the trees, animals moving nearby, rain on the roof. Silas's earth-sheltered structure muffled all external noise. The thick earth walls created an acoustic barrier that isolated the interior almost completely. He could hear his own breathing, the small sounds of settling timbers, nothing more. The temperature inside was noticeably warmer than outside, even without a fire. Silas had installed a thermometer, a precious instrument he had purchased in St. Louis, mounting it to one of the support posts. That first evening, with outside temperature around 35 degrees, the interior read 48 degrees. The Earth's thermal mass was already apparent. He built a small fire in the fireplace, using perhaps a quarter of the wood he would have burned in a conventional cabin. The fire warmed the interior rapidly. Within an hour, the thermometer read 62 degrees. He allowed the fire to burn down to coals, then banked it carefully and prepared for sleep. Morning revealed the critical test. The fire had gone out completely sometime during the night. Outside, temperature had dropped to 23 degrees. Inside, the thermometer read 51 degrees. The structure had cooled only slightly, losing perhaps 11 degrees over the night, while outside temperature had dropped 12 degrees. The differential was exactly what Silas had hoped to achieve. Over the following weeks, as November brought deeper cold, the pattern repeated with even more dramatic results. On nights when outside temperature dropped below zero, the interior never fell below 47 degrees, even with no fire at all. A small fire built in the evening and allowed to burn out would leave the interior at 65 degrees. By morning, it would have cooled to perhaps 55 degrees, still comfortable enough to move around without heavy clothing. Silas began keeping detailed records in his notebook. He recorded outside temperature, inside temperature, fire size and duration, and his own comfort level. The data confirmed what he had theorized. The earth-sheltered structure required approximately 1/10 the firewood of a conventional cabin to maintain comfortable temperatures. More significantly, even with no fire, the structure never approached dangerous cold. A man could survive indefinitely inside without burning any wood, though comfort would be minimal. December brought the season's first serious cold, temperatures dropping to 15 below zero for 3 consecutive nights. Silas burned modest fires each evening, using perhaps 2 armloads of wood per day. The contrast between Silas's experience and his neighbor's struggles became apparent as winter deepened. Amos Harlan's cabin, located approximately 6 miles west, required constant attention to remain habitable. Amos burned a full cord of wood every 5 days, spending hours each day cutting, splitting, and hauling timber. Even with massive fires, his cabin's interior temperature fluctuated wildly, warm near the fireplace but cold everywhere else. Cyrus Pemberton faced similar challenges. His cabin, newer than Amos's and built with careful attention to chinking, still leaked heat relentlessly. He had calculated that maintaining a minimally comfortable interior required burning approximately 80 pounds of wood every 24 hours. The labor was exhausting, and the danger was constant. One mistake, one night when he was too tired to wake and feed the fire, could result in the same fate that had killed Obadiah. Other trappers in the territory dealt with the same brutal mathematics. Winter survival was a daily battle against cold that required continuous effort and allowed no rest. Men woke multiple times each night to feed fires. They worked in dangerous conditions to harvest firewood, risking frostbite and injury. The oldest trappers, those with 15 or 20 winters of experience, showed the cumulative toll in damaged fingers and toes, the legacy of countless close calls with freezing. Silas's situation was fundamentally different. He woke once each night, added a single log to his fire, and returned to sleep. His daily firewood consumption was perhaps 15 pounds, 1/5 what his neighbors burned. He spent perhaps an hour every 3 days gathering wood, compared to their 3 or 4 hours daily. The difference was not merely convenience, but safety. Silas had eliminated the constant danger that defined winter for everyone else. Word of his comfort spread through chance encounters. In mid-December, a trapper named Elijah Morrison stopped at Silas's structure while passing through the territory. Elijah had heard about the hole in the ground, but had never seen it. When he arrived, cold and exhausted from traveling in brutal weather, Silas invited him inside. Elijah stepped through the door and stopped, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to wonder. The interior was comfortably warm despite the small fire burning in the corner. The air was still and quiet, without the drafts that made conventional cabins uncomfortable. The temperature was steady throughout the space, not hot near the fire and cold everywhere else. "How is this possible?" Elijah asked, removing his heavy coat, because the interior was actually too warm for winter clothing. Silas explained the principles as simply as he could. The earth maintained constant temperature. The thick walls and roof provided insulation no wooden structure could match. Heat from even a small fire was trapped and held by the thermal mass of the surrounding earth. The structure worked with natural principles rather than fighting against them. Elijah stayed for 2 hours, warming himself and asking detailed questions about construction methods. When he finally left, continuing his journey, he carried knowledge that would spread further through the trapping community. The storm arrived on January 9, 1840, with a ferocity that old-timers would reference for decades afterward. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees below zero. Wind drove snow horizontally across the landscape, creating drifts that buried anything less than 6 feet tall. Visibility disappeared completely. The blizzard lasted 4 days without pause, trapping every trapper in the territory inside whatever shelter they occupied when it began. Silas watched the storm's approach from his doorway, reading the sky with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to respect mountain weather. He gathered an extra supply of firewood, perhaps 3 days' worth by his modest consumption rate, and secured his door against the coming wind. Then he settled inside to wait out the storm in relative comfort. The blizzard's fury was audible even through the thick earth walls. Wind howled across the hillside above him, but inside the shelter the air remained still and quiet. Snow piled against his entrance, drifting to depths that would have buried a conventional cabin's door, but Silas had built his entrance to shed snow naturally. The south-facing orientation meant sun would clear the approach quickly once the storm passed. He maintained a small fire continuously during the storm, more for light and cooking than for heat. The interior temperature held steady at 63 degrees. Outside, the thermometer he had mounted near the door registered temperatures that would kill an exposed man in minutes. Inside, Silas sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, reading from one of the 3 books he owned, occasionally adding a single log to his fire. 6 miles away, Amos Harland fought for survival. His cabin, built to conventional standards, provided shelter from wind but minimal protection from cold. He burned wood frantically, feeding his fire every hour, watching helplessly as interior temperature hovered barely above freezing despite the roaring flames. He wore every piece of clothing he owned. He buried himself in furs and blankets. Sleep came in brief intervals between fire-feeding sessions. By the second day, he had burned through his entire indoor wood supply and was forced to venture outside repeatedly to bring in more from his woodpile. Each trip outside was dangerous. The wind-driven cold penetrated his heaviest coat within seconds. His hands grew clumsy in heavy mittens. Snow filled his eyes and mouth. He could barely see his woodpile 15 feet from the door. He made perhaps 20 such trips over 4 days, each one risking frostbite and disorientation. By the storm's end, he had burned approximately 6 cords of wood and suffered frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. Cyrus Pemberton's experience was similar. His newer cabin performed marginally better than Amos's, but the fundamental problem remained. No amount of fire could overcome the heat loss through wooden walls and roof when outside temperature dropped so low. Cyrus burned 5 cords of wood during the blizzard and emerged with frostbitten toes that would trouble him for the rest of his life. Thaddeus Kincaid, trapping along a creek valley 10 miles north, faced catastrophic failure. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, a massive snow load caused his cabin's roof to partially collapse. Snow poured through the breach, extinguishing his fire. The interior temperature plummeted. Thaddeus survived only by abandoning the cabin and digging a snow cave, using techniques he had learned from reading accounts of Arctic expeditions. The blizzard ended on the morning of January 13th. The wind died suddenly, replaced by absolute calm and brilliant sunshine reflecting off fresh snow. The temperature remained brutally cold, 25 below zero, in full daylight, but the storm's violence had passed. Across the territory, trappers emerged from their shelters to assess damage and check on neighbors. Silas ventured out mid-morning, following the creek drainage toward Thaddeus Kincaid's territory. The snow was deep, nearly 4 feet in places where drifting had occurred, but his snowshoes made progress possible. He traveled slowly, conserving energy, watching for signs of other trappers. He found Thaddeus 2 miles from the collapsed cabin, struggling through deep snow without snowshoes, clearly in distress. Thaddeus's face showed the gray-white patches of frostbite. His movements were clumsy and uncoordinated, indicating advancing hypothermia. He had been traveling since dawn, trying to reach another trapper's cabin, but the deep snow had slowed him to perhaps a quarter mile per hour. "Silas," called out. Thaddeus turned, his expression showing relief mixed with confusion. They knew each other slightly, having crossed paths during previous seasons, but were not close acquaintances. Silas reached him quickly on snowshoes, assessed his condition, and made an immediate decision. "Can you walk?" Silas asked. "I think so," Thaddeus replied, his voice slurred from cold. "My shelter is 2 miles south. We need to move now." The journey took 3 hours. Silas broke trail, Thaddeus following in his tracks, stopping frequently to rest. By the time they reached Silas's hillside location, Thaddeus was barely conscious, moving through pure determination rather than physical capability. Silas guided him through the entrance into the earth-sheltered interior. The temperature differential was so extreme that Thaddeus gasped, the warm air painful against his frozen face. Silas removed Thaddeus's frozen outer clothing, wrapped him in furs, and positioned him near the small fire. Then he prepared warm broth from dried meat and melted snow, forcing Thaddeus to drink slowly despite his body's craving for immediate warmth. Over the next hour, Thaddeus gradually recovered. Color returned to his face. His shivering intensified, then slowly subsided. His speech cleared, and his awareness of his surroundings sharpened from confused gratitude to active observation. "What is this place?" he asked finally, looking around the interior with growing comprehension. "A cabin," Silas replied simply. "This is what people were talking about, the hole in the ground. I thought they were exaggerating." Silas explained what had happened to Thaddeus's cabin. The roof collapse, which Silas had anticipated based on the snow load, had left Thaddeus with no shelter. His survival by snow cave had been clever but temporary. Without intervention, he would have frozen within another day. "How is it so warm in here?" Thaddeus asked, removing his inner coat because the interior temperature was genuinely comfortable. "Your fire is smaller than what I used for cooking." Silas explained the principles again, as he had to others. The Earth's constant temperature, the insulation value of 6 feet of soil, the thermal mass that stored and released heat slowly, the minimal heat loss through only one exposed wall. Thaddeus stayed with Silas for 5 days, recovering from frostbite and gathering strength before attempting to salvage what remained of his collapsed cabin. During those days, he asked detailed questions about every aspect of the earth-sheltered construction. Unlike the skeptics who had dismissed Silas's work as madness, Thaddeus approached it as a student learning from a teacher. "Explain the temperature again," Thaddeus requested on the second evening, sitting near Silas's small fire with a notebook borrowed from Silas's supplies. "You said the ground stays at 50 degrees. Why?" Silas shared what he had learned in St. Louis from the German stonemason. The Earth's temperature at depth was determined by the average air temperature over the entire year. Montana's summers reached perhaps 80 degrees. Winters dropped to 40 below. Averaged across 12 months, the temperature was approximately 50 degrees. The ground at 6 feet depth stayed at that average, largely unaffected by daily or even seasonal temperature swings. "But how does that help you?" Thaddeus pressed. 50 degrees is still cold." 50 degrees is warm compared to 40 below, Silas explained. "A conventional cabin in winter has to heat air from 40 below up to 65 if you want comfort. That's a difference of over 100 degrees. My structure only has to heat from 50 to 65. That's 15 degrees. The Earth does most of the work." Thaddeus worked through the mathematics in his notebook. "So you need less wood because you're starting from a warmer baseline." "Exactly. And the thick earth walls hold heat inside once it's generated. A wooden cabin loses heat through every surface. Mine only loses heat through the entrance wall." They discussed insulation, a concept Thaddeus had never considered in formal terms. Silas explained that materials resisted heat flow at different rates. Air moved heat quickly through convection. Wood was better, resisting heat flow more effectively. Earth, especially dense clay, was better still. 6 feet of earth provided insulation that no practical thickness of wood could match. "The mason in St. Louis told me a foot of earth equals approximately 4 inches of wood for insulation," Silas said. "My walls are 6 feet of earth. That would be equivalent to a wooden wall 2 feet thick. No one builds walls 2 feet thick." Thaddeus grasped the implications immediately. "So even a small fire creates more heat than can escape through your walls." "And the earth itself stores that heat," Silas added. "The clay in the walls absorbs warmth from inside and releases it slowly. It's like having a massive stone that stays warm for hours after you heat it." They discussed structural concerns. Thaddeus worried about collapse, having just experienced his own roof failure. Silas explained load distribution, showing how his support posts transferred the earth's weight to the ground rather than letting it rest on the timber ceiling. The posts were more than adequate for the load, similar to how mine shafts supported far greater earth weight with similar techniques. Waterproofing fascinated Thaddeus particularly. He had struggled with leaking roofs in conventional cabins and understood how moisture could make shelter uninhabitable. Silas described his layered approach: the canvas barrier, the clay waterproofing, the birch bark shingling, the soil crown that shed water sideways. Thaddeus has left Silas's shelter in late January with detailed sketches and extensive notes. He had spent hours measuring every aspect of the construction, recording dimensions, techniques, and materials. Silas shared his knowledge freely, answering every question with the patience of a man who understood that good ideas benefited everyone when survival was at stake. The salvage of Thaddeus's collapsed cabin yielded useful materials: logs that could be repurposed, tools that had survived the roof failure, supplies that remained dry enough to use. But Thaddeus had no intention of rebuilding in the conventional style. He had experienced firsthand the difference between struggling to survive in a wooden structure and living comfortably in an earth-sheltered one. He selected a site 3 miles from his original location, a south-facing hillside similar to what Silas had chosen. The excavation began in early February, brutal work in winter conditions, but Thaddeus was motivated by recent memory of nearly freezing to death. He worked steadily, following Silas's methods, digging into the stable clay hillside to create a cavity that would become his new home. Silas visited periodically, offering guidance and assistance with the most difficult aspects of construction. He helped Thaddeus position the support posts correctly, explaining again how critical proper alignment was for long-term stability. He demonstrated the clay mixture preparation, showing the proper consistency and fat content for waterproofing. He shared techniques for fitting logs tightly in the entrance wall. The work progressed through late winter and early spring. Thaddeus's structure was slightly smaller than Silas's, perhaps 10 feet wide by 14 feet deep, reflecting the reduced materials available from his salvaged cabin. But the principles were identical: deep excavation into stable hillside, robust timber support structure, careful waterproofing with multiple redundant layers, single entrance wall with all other surfaces earth protected. Other trappers noticed the construction. Word had already spread about Silas's unusual shelter and how it had saved Thaddeus's life during the blizzard. Now seeing Thaddeus deliberately building another earth-sheltered structure, rather than a conventional cabin, created new discussions among the scattered trapping community. Amos Harland visited the construction site in March, his frost-damaged fingers still bandaged from the blizzard. He watched Thaddeus working on the entrance wall, observed the excavated hillside, examined the support timbers, and said nothing for a long time. Finally he spoke. "I burned 6 cords of wood during that storm and nearly froze anyway," Amos said quietly. "Lost 3 fingers to frostbite." "How much wood did Thornton burn?" "Perhaps half a cord," Thaddeus replied. "He was comfortable the entire time, sat reading in his shirt sleeves while we were fighting for our lives." Amos examined the construction more carefully, asking technical questions about excavation depth, support structure, and waterproofing. The mockery that had characterized his earlier reactions was absent, replaced by practical interest born from painful experience. Cyrus Pemberton arrived a week later, also showing signs of frostbite damage from the blizzard. He and Amos discussed the construction together, comparing it to their own winter experiences, calculating firewood savings, assessing the labor investment required versus the ongoing benefit. "It's more work up front," Cyrus acknowledged. "But if it means burning 1/10 the wood every winter and never worrying about freezing if the fire goes out, the work is worth it." Thaddeus completed his earth-sheltered cabin in early April of 1840. He moved his supplies inside, built his first fire in the small stone fireplace, and experienced the same revelation Silas had known months earlier. The structure was warmer, quieter, and fundamentally more secure than any conventional cabin he had occupied. The spring trapping season proceeded normally. Men dispersed across the territory to work their trap lines, gathering pelts before summer heat made the work impractical. But conversations around occasional campfires and chance encounters now included new topics. Earth-sheltered construction was no longer dismissed as madness, but discussed as a legitimate building method with specific advantages. Amos Harland began his own earth-sheltered structure in June of 1840. He chose a hillside within a mile of his original cabin, which he left standing as a storage building but abandoned as living quarters. His construction followed the methods Silas and Thaddeus had proven, with minor modifications based on his own carpentry experience and available materials. Cyrus Pemberton started excavation in July, selecting a site that offered superior drainage compared to his conventional cabin's location. He worked methodically through summer, completing the structure by early September, well ahead of winter's arrival. The adoption was not universal. Some trappers remained skeptical, unwilling to invest the labor required for excavation and construction. Others lacked the carpentry skills necessary to build the support structure safely. A few simply preferred conventional methods out of habit or principle. But among serious trappers, those planning to spend multiple winters in the mountains, earth-sheltered construction became an accepted option. The structures varied in details. Some builders made their excavations deeper, creating more headroom. Others modified the entrance wall design, using different log fitting techniques or adding extra windows. A few experimented with fireplace placement and chimney design, but the core principles remained consistent. Excavate into stable hillside, install robust support structure, waterproof thoroughly with multiple layers, minimize exposed surfaces. By 1841, 7 earth-sheltered cabins existed within a 50-mile radius of Silas's original structure. The number grew to 12 by 1842. The technique spread not through formal teaching or published plans, but through direct observation and person-to-person knowledge transfer. Trappers who had survived winters comfortably in earth-sheltered structures shared their experience with others who had struggled in conventional cabins. The name Thornton-style cabin emerged gradually, used by trappers to distinguish earth-sheltered construction from conventional building. Silas never promoted the name or claimed credit for the innovation. He simply continued his trapping work, living quietly in the structure he had built, helping others when asked, but never evangelizing his methods. The scattered trapping community developed informal standards for earth-sheltered construction based on collective experience. Excavation depth should be at least 12 feet to provide adequate interior space. Earth cover should be minimum 6 feet for proper insulation. Support posts should be at least 10 inches square, hewn from dense hardwood. Waterproofing required multiple redundant layers because failure meant uninhabitable dampness. The Rocky Mountain fur trade's final collapse came in the mid-1840s. Beaver populations had been trapped to commercial extinction in many watersheds. More critically, European fashion had shifted away from beaver felt hats toward silk, destroying the market that had supported the entire mountain man economy. Trappers began leaving the mountains, seeking other opportunities in Oregon, California, or returning east to settled territories. Silas left his earth-sheltered cabin in the spring of 1847. He had spent 8 winters in the structure, more than twice the lifespan of most conventional cabins. The building showed no signs of deterioration. The support timbers remained solid. The waterproofing held perfectly. The entrance wall logs were tight and secure. He could have occupied it for another decade without major repairs. He traveled to Oregon Territory, invested his savings in a small ranch near the Willamette Valley, and married in 1848. His wife, Margaret, was the widow of a farmer who had died during the overland journey west. She brought 2 young children to the marriage. Silas became a stepfather and eventually a father, settling into domestic life that bore no resemblance to his years alone in the mountains. He never spoke much about his time trapping beaver or the cabin he had built into a hillside. To his family and neighbors in Oregon, he was simply a quiet man who had come west early, worked hard, and built a successful ranch. When he died in 1869 at age 61, his obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his ranching accomplishments and community involvement, but made no reference to his innovations in frontier construction. But in the mountains of Montana and Wyoming, the earth-sheltered cabins remained. Some were still occupied by trappers who had stayed in the mountains, transitioning to hunting and guiding as the fur trade disappeared. Others sat abandoned but intact, their earth-covered roofs gradually returning to the natural hillside appearance until they were nearly invisible. Settlers moving west in the 1850s and 60s discovered these structures. A family traveling the Bozeman Trail found one in 1863 and occupied it for 2 winters before building a conventional farmhouse. A group of prospectors used another as a base camp during the Montana Gold Rush. The cabin's superior insulation and durability made them valuable resources for anyone who found them. The technique itself persisted in scattered form. Homesteaders building permanent structures sometimes incorporated earth-sheltering principles, creating root cellars and storage buildings partially excavated into hillsides. A few built entire homes using methods derived from the trapping-era innovations, though they rarely knew the origin of the techniques they employed. Modern archaeological surveys of Montana and Wyoming have documented at least 18 earth-sheltered structures dating to the 1840 through 1860 period. Several remain partially intact, their timber supports still solid after more than a century, testament to the engineering principles that guided their construction. One, discovered in 1897 by a surveying party, was still habitable. Its interior dry and its temperature noticeably warmer than the outside air, even after over 50 years with no fire burning.